Welcome to our next talk, Community Game Development in Rust, a Biopsy, with Forrest Anderson. Forrest is a student who enjoys making games and running security competitions. He is currently a fourth-year student at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He is studying computer science with honors in game development. Forrest is the meta lead on the Veloren project, in which he focuses on CI and community development. He also writes a weekly dev blog that highlights the project's progress. Forrest has done research in the graphics, images, and games lab at Carleton. His research focuses on image processing and web security. Please welcome him and enjoy his talk.
Hello everybody, my name is Forrest Anderson. Today I'm going to be talking about community game development in Rust from an open source perspective. So a little bit about me. I am a student at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, where I'm studying computer science with honors in game development. I work on a ton of open source projects, and I have been doing so for about the last 3 years. And I also enjoy doing a lot of game development and computer security. The game I'm going to be talking about today is called Veloren. Veloren started around 2018, and it came from a group of people who got together and were inspired by a game that they had played previously but was closed source and wasn't getting that many updates. And this game was called Cube World. You can think of it as very similar to Minecraft in a way, with the voxel sort of aesthetic, but a lot of the gameplay is different. And so Veloren is an open world, open source, multiplayer voxel RPG. So in Minecraft, you go around and create many things in a voxel world, whereas this one's more about exploration and character development and the world around you. But the interesting thing about Veloren is it's built by an open source community from around the world. And so with Veloren, the project has been going for approximately 2 years now. And we've learned a lot about open source development and the language that we are using to build it. And so I'm going to be going through a lot of that in the talk today. So the layout of the talk, we'll start with talking about the community, and we'll go in depth on some tips and tricks that we've learned. We'll then go into the engine, where we'll discuss what we've learned while working with the Rust language. Third of all, we'll talk about the research and development, so some interesting systems that have come from our development. And finally, we'll discuss the future of Veloren in regards to how we financially sustain ourselves, as well as some ideas we're hoping to move towards in the future. So to start off, let's talk about the community. So Veloren has over 100 recorded contributors who have added a little bit of code to the game, plus many other artists and composers and designers and writers that have also helped with the process. We use a working group structure, and we focus on 10 quite agile teams. However, we try to keep the hierarchy very flat, in the sense that each team lead, their purpose is to work on the ground level with any beginners or anybody who needs help. We also use Discord as our main form of communication, and we're able to very easily discuss with the players their thoughts, but also keep in touch with our developers. So Veloren itself is an open source project, is released under the GPL3 license. It was built in Rustlang from the ground up and from the beginning as well. When we started the project in 2018, Rust was a lot younger in the sense of game development, and so we'll kind of take a look at how we've dealt with the ecosystem. Veloren targets Linux as a first-class operating system, and we build for Windows and Mac OS. However, since most of the developers work on Linux in the first place, it's a high priority for us to make sure that it's supported very well. So as I mentioned, we're using the working group structure to manage our teams. And so we have approximately, I think, 10 groups, and each group focuses on a specific domain. So each group lead, their purpose is to be able to be a point of contact for many of these ideas, to be able to help beginners, and to be able to discuss what they are working on in team meetings. And so the working groups that we have I've kind of split them up into 4 different categories here. And so we have the core, which deals a lot with the engine itself. And so we have a lot of stuff like the rendering, how the combat is done, world generation, and multiplayer. Support, which is where I focus most of my time. We have the meta team, testing, and UX. Under content, we have many people who are contributing to the project who might not know a ton about code, but are amazing artists and composers and designers. We have people who can even contribute if they are from a different country and speak a different language. We have a translation system that will allow any language to be put into Veloren. And we're also kind of experimenting with modding. It's been on and off for quite a while, but I'll discuss that a little bit more in the engine section. So the first one of the groups that we have is the meta group, and this is the group that I am the lead of. And so this group focuses on many of the intermediate sort of problems that come up in the project. And so whether it be reaching out to either do interviews or to write articles, I also write the weekly dev blog, and this is like a really great way to get contributors' work noticed. I work on making sure that the community is doing well and is quite healthy, and I do a lot of stuff with our Git, our continuous integration and continuous deployment, as well as a lot of pretty fun Rust compiler stuff to try and optimize our workflow. So with the blog, this is some content that I put out each week, and this really allows our community to be able to understand what's happening on the project. We want to be very transparent with it, but it also allows developers to talk about what they've been working on. Because for developers who have been taking time out of their day to contribute and volunteer to a project, once they have a feature that is ready, it's incredibly important to share that with the community, so that they know that their work is being recognized, but also so that the community can see all of the cool stuff that is going on and how they might be able to get involved as well. And we're almost at our 100th dev blog, and I'm pretty excited for that because I started writing the dev blog when I started the project in January 2019. So throughout this talk, we're going to also hear from a couple other team leads on the project. And so to start off, we're going to hear from the game design lead, Silentium.
I'm Silentium. I'm the game design working group lead, and I've been working on the project since late 2019. I live in the US, and it's been a crazy, fun experience. So some of the coolest things that we've managed to achieve with our design, it feels more like an improvement on an idea that's come before. So a good example of this is we decided to have the skills and abilities that the player uses come from the specific weapons being used rather than a class. And as was pointed out, this is kind of like a class system because you're choosing your class based on which weapon you're equipping, but it keeps you from being locked into a certain role without being able to change too much. So the structure of getting us together is essentially on the Discord channel. I will make a game design meeting announcement, and then people will show up as they want to. And we typically end up bringing up more people to the meetings than are actually part of the game design working group, which I really like. There are people who are just listening in because they want to know what's going on. They see people sitting in chat and they hop in and they just listen. So we end up with 15 people sometimes. And organizing ideas is everybody talking about what they think is a good design, and then we all talk about ways in which that could inhibit certain other elements, cause problems in certain other areas, and we try to, regardless of what the idea is, talk about it in its entirety before making a decision whether we like it or not. A good example is the last time we had a meeting, we were trying to decide if boats and exploring water was going to be just as easy as walking around on the land, and whether or not the player would need to put more time and effort into accruing a boat, and all of the exploration consequences of what that would mean to the player and where they can go. All of these things need to be discussed before we make a decision about it. So having this many minds thinking about the same system or idea for game design is probably our strongest asset, is that we have so many people saying and considering and thinking in ways that the rest aren't, because we're all different. It's taught me a lot about how to share ideas and how to perfect them, because somebody will probably come to the meeting with an idea and then we'll leave that meeting with a version of that idea that doesn't look too much like it did when it came into the meeting, but that is a better version of itself.
So next, let's go over a little bit of the timeline of Veloren. So in summer 2018, a post was made to Reddit asking if anybody would be interested in working on an open source project that took inspiration from CubeWorld. And many people were interested. And so they started working on the first iteration of the Valerian Engine. They worked on this for approximately 6 months until the end of 2018, in which they accrued a lot of technical debt and issues that were not foreseen. And so they started working on the groundwork for a new engine. And at the beginning of 2019 was about when I joined the project as well. And so with this new engine, it featured many new things. The architecture was a lot more thought out for what the purpose was, and it removed a lot of the issues that were found in the first legacy engine. Throughout 2019, 3 versions were released, and it started with Veloren being a very simplistic world where you could sort of do a little bit of multiplayer, you could sort of do a little bit of terrain generation, but it moved up to a point where there was a lot more terrain features and content at the end of 2019. And throughout 2020, 3 new versions were also released, and in fact we're going to be releasing 0.8 next week. So with Veloren being an open source project, we've learned a lot of very cool things about developing in an open source community. So first and foremost, open source is not a company. And so there are many things that we can accomplish because we are an open source project that you wouldn't see at larger companies. And so one of the biggest things is that we do not experience the same deadlines and we're not held accountable to the same clients. This means that when someone wants to come in and work on the project, they can work on whatever feature they want for as long as they want. And because of that, we've gotten some very cool systems implemented in Veloren, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also focus a lot on making sure that we have sustainable development. And so the idea behind this is if someone is unable to work on the project for a period of time, there needs to be an easy transition for them to stop working on the product and then come back later when they need to. And so this can often be because people are having like a lot of work to do, or they have school to worry about, or anything like that. And so having a very welcoming community that makes sure that we're not forcing people to work on the project is essential to us. Also, sustainable development means that we can have beginners come and work on the project without overhead of having to go through the process of hiring them and make sure that they're the only one that is able to work on it. Because of this, we want to make sure that it's very easy for beginners to get up and running on the project, and so many of our team leads work very closely with new developers to make sure that they're able to accomplish what they like. Also, not everything needs to be perfect in an open source project. As I mentioned, we don't necessarily need to hit the same deadlines, and if a feature isn't ready for one version, it's okay, it can be pushed back to the next version. We also make sure that when having discussions, it's okay to be wrong. It's okay for people to change their mind, and it's okay to go in different directions if we find that something isn't working. So from the management perspective, some of the ways that we accomplish these pillars is, first of all, making sure that when people come to the project, they get where they need to be. And so, for example, if an expert in a specific domain comes and works on the project, they need to be able to talk to the team leads that are able to get them where they need to be right away. So we've had some experiences where some people who are very well versed in graphical debugging have come into the project, and we've gotten them set up as quickly as possible with the tools that they need so that they can give us a lot of information with their specific domain. We've also found that collaborating with other products in the ecosystem has helped us out significantly. There are a lot of Rust game dev products on the go right now, and hearing from people in the community not only helps us know about other technologies that we could potentially use, but also get ideas of ways that we could be doing things better within the Rust language. We create a strong like entry level for beginners by tasking many of our issues as, or rather labeling them as beginner issues or as easy issues. And the purpose behind this is that we want beginners to come on and start working and getting small wins right away. They don't need to be working on the hardest tasks and getting stuck and then leaving, but instead, if we can help them get past the entry point, then oftentimes we've seen them contribute significantly more. And one of the biggest things is that we need to make sure that beginners are not only getting the help that they need, but also getting their work shown off. Because when they come in and work on a small task, it's very important for the experienced core developers to also understand what the process is like for them. So hearing from the beginners what kinds of stuff that they got stuck on and what kinds of stuff that they found very cool about the engine. And so what I do is whenever I can, I reach out to beginners and I get them to write a section for the dev blog. And this is a very valuable write-up for everybody. Next, we also work very hard to continuously improve the community. And so there's a couple of things that we really have to keep in mind. There are, when you're working with people from around the world, there's a lot of barriers that you have to overcome. So for example, one of the biggest ones is the language barrier. You also have time zones. But specifically when communicating, often we're communicating over text. And so for someone who isn't a native English speaker, it can often be difficult to convey the idea exactly as you intend. And because of that, it might be misinterpreted, and that can often lead to tension. And so keeping an eye on the community and making sure that things don't get heated is something that all of our core team and admins take very seriously. We also keep in mind that good skill does not override toxicity. And so what this means is that if someone is an expert in something on Veloren, if they are having difficulty like staying positive in the community, and if they are bringing the community as an as an entirety down, then it's much more important to make sure that they are not part of the project if they can't abide by the rules and the code of conduct. So next up, let's hear from the Assets and Visual Design lead, Val.
Hi, I'm Val. I'm currently taking the role of the lead artist for Valerian. I'm living in Germany and joined the project in 2018. My work mostly consists of coordinating all the people wanting to contribute art to our project. Another role I have to fulfill is to have like an oversight of all the assets we have, and that's not only art, that's also audio and things like documents and spreadsheets, and organizing our Google Drive folder where contributors can just upload things they think might help us. So it's lots of assets management and file management, but not only that, it's also reviewing pieces of art people hand into us and send in to the various Discord channels we have. And it's all about this open process of showing pieces of art openly to everyone and making everyone able to give feedback onto it, and then combining all this feedback into like something usable for the game that fits our overall theme and the quality we want to achieve with the pieces of art we include into the game. So what tools am I using? Well, when I started off, I didn't have any professional tools, but the free tool Magical Voxel, which is closed source but still open source friendly piece of software. It runs on all platforms. So how is our style determined? To talk about this, I have to go back to our origins, how this all started. And I think it's very clear that we're coming from the Minecraft cube world style with the voxels all around. I personally call it a cheap clone visually of these games, which is totally okay because you have to like start from somewhere. At this time in 2018, this was where we came from, and while the engine advanced in features, we were able to apply more and more visual details to our characters, and we kind of developed a feeling for what we wanted Valorant to look like. It's more about creating this maybe something like high fantasy medieval feeling you'd find in games like World of Warcraft. So we'd be able to do things that are also maybe a little bit more creepy, like zombies and undeads and ghosts and demons and all this kind of stuff, and you would take them more serious because they would end up looking like something that could hurt your character very badly. And I think, yeah, that's our style.
Alright, next up, let's take a look at the Valerian Engine. The Valerian Engine is built in Rust. Rust is a programming language that came out in 2015, and so it's still quite new, but it offers us a lot of benefits that older systems languages cannot. So there's something that's known as a Rust trifecta, and this is the idea that Rust provides three pillars. The first one is that it's fast, and so it operates at the same speed as C and C++. The second is that it's safe, and so from Rust's memory safety guarantees, you can be sure that an entire suite of possible problems will be completely eradicated. And this is especially important in game development because when you are running your game at 60 frames per second, it becomes very, very difficult to debug potential memory issues or race conditions that might be happening on different threads. Third of all, Rust is incredibly concurrent because of its memory safety. When you are running code in different threads, you can be sure that the memory safety guarantees are going to make sure that when your threads come back, they're not going to be overlapping with one another. And fourth of all, Rust is incredibly ergonomic, and so when you're working on larger teams, it makes it very easy to do parallel development without being scared that someone else might mess up something that will then be difficult to debug. Now, another great part about Rust is that instead of it being object-oriented, in game development, you focus on an entity component system in Rust. And an entity component system is sort of a different paradigm from object-oriented, in which you focus on entities and the memory that they take up. But because of this, you can get tasks to execute in an incredibly parallel way across different threads. And so we use an entity component system with Veloren, and then this is one of the key factors that allows us to run the game and run the server in an incredibly parallel environment. Rust also has a great crate ecosystem, and what a crate is Rust's version of a library or a package. And so with other systems languages, often you'd have to install a library on your computer and make sure that your compiler linked it. But with Rust, on the other hand, it has a very strong packaging system that takes care of all of this legwork for you. This means that in the game development world, when you want to import a whole bunch of math crates and graphics crates and windowing crates, you're able to do so in such an easy way. And so there's this website, Are We Game Yet?, that tracks how far Rust has gone in the game development ecosystem and what problems you might run into. And then you're actually able to look by category and see if you're looking, for example, for some type of AI package, then you're able to go and see what options are out there for you. Next up, let's hear a little bit from our networking and multiplayer lead, XMAC.
Hi, my name is Marcel Mertens, I am from Germany and I am leader of the server and multiplayer working group in Veloren. I started with the project around 1 or 2 weeks after Zestower initially announced it. I'm a guy who is really interested in programming like back-end stuff, and like this is something which makes physics, simulation or networking coding especially interesting for me. Veloren uses the Rust language. It was totally new to me when I first got in contact with Veloren, but it's super easy to learn. There's a book. So for our custom built engine, we asked ourselves how to do networking best, and we looked at other protocols and are a bit inspired by what is HTTP2 doing. They communicate over a single connection, but they can have multiple streams of data, and this is interesting because when we are running a game and there are multiple clients connected to it, there are different kinds of data which need to be sent to the clients or back to the server. The easiest thing you can think of, sending on one side Terrain data, like big worlds, which can be millions of blocks, and you can send like entity update data, or for example, if you are in a fight and want to know the position of your enemy. And what is important for a server is that if you are in gameplay and you are fighting, for example, that you are getting the current position of the enemy to the point and you're getting it as fast as possible. So Veloren's engine is using an ECS or entity component system to structure our in-game entities. The ECS allows us to assign different components, e.g. health, physics states, if it is invincible, to entities, and an entity can be everything which appears in the world. We are using the entity component system on both the server and the client. This makes our coding very easy because we can just take the whole state, compress it and send it over. The data is very compact and easily compressible. We built our engine from ground up for multiplayer. So what we are doing is Even a single player game is basically just a multiplayer server with only one client connected to it, which makes it super easy to introduce a feature for single player as well as multiplayer, so we don't have to do double the coding. When you introduce a feature into the server, then it's also automatically introduced into the client.
For Veloren, we use GitLab as our Git platform. This provides us with many benefits, not only for the version control side of things, but we also use it to track all of our issues. And this allows it to be a really great place to be able to refer anybody if they need to look at the code, if they need to see issues, if they need to see any merge requests that are coming in. And one of the really important things that we do is we label issues for their priority, for the working group that it affects, but also for their difficulty. This means that if someone comes to the project who wants to start contributing, then it's much easier for them to find something that they can work on that doesn't necessarily touch all systems. And so it can be quite well scoped and quite easy to take care of as a first task. We also use a continuous integration system that is built into GitLab's pipeline. This system allows us to do checks to make sure that before code is merged into master, that it is verified, that the tests run, that benchmarks pass, and also that, well, more specifically, if there's some code that was added that slows down one of the systems in Veloren, we can find that out ahead of time. We also make sure that there's no major linting issues, as well as the code is formatted nicely. Next up, let's hear from our animations lead, Slipped.
Hi, so my name is Justin, or Slipped in the Discord. I'm from the East Coast of the US, and I work primarily on animation in Valerian. So I joined the project right about the time that it started, and I did a lot of work with like art and assets and things like that. And then when we were able to build the animation engine into the game, I took over working on a lot of that. And so we've gotten to a point where we animated humanoids, and then from there we took that into animating different kind of quadrupeds and things like that. And we're starting to get into animating like bosses and a lot of exciting stuff like that. We don't work in any outside program like Blender or something like that I think people would be used to. We do everything in Engine, and so everything is hard-coded, which is kind of a blessing and a curse for us. What it means is that first off, we're able to do hot loading animations, which gives us this really nice setup where we can just save our files and then instantly see the results of that in game. And so we can instantly see the animation that we're doing in real time, which is a lot better than what you would get if you were working in an outside program. The downside to it, of course, is that we do code everything, which I think a lot of people would not be super familiar with right away. But once you really get into it and you understand what you're doing, I think it does become very intuitive. And so Valerian has a lot of nicer aspects of it, doing things the way we do it. We can work with things like velocities and orientations of entities in a way that's very advantageous. We can bring those right in and see the results of it on screen and use those to alter the animations in a procedural way and generate a lot of nice results from that. But I would say that the main thing I've learned about animation since I kind of got into it, because I hadn't really animated anything before, is about just how much of an iterative process it is. And so if you look at the game through 0.3, 0.4 up until now going into 0.8, most of the progress is not so much expensive, but just within each animation, like a very slow progression to where they get to where they are today. And we're not perfect. I mean, we're going to continue to develop the same animations, I'm sure, in a pretty big way, but just adding on to everything as we go has been really exciting. And like just learning different bits about things like orientation tilting and velocity tilting has been very exciting. And throwing in different tools to make things work in different ways that are really unique. Recently we added a pace system into our quadrupeds, and so now they go through like a full series of gates from like a gallop into a sprint and a trot and things like that. And so they are getting to a point where they look fairly finalized with a lot more still to come there.
Next, we'll take a look at some of the research and development that have gone into the systems in Veloren. One of our biggest systems is our world gen system, and this is built up from many different sort of subsystems. The idea behind the world gen system is that it sort of decides how the world is built before the player will start playing on it. One of the systems that really gives it a lot of what it is the erosion and river system. This is something that is simulated during the map creation, and it allows for actual realistic water paths throughout the map. And so the idea is when you have rivers, eventually they'll get fed into a larger basin of water. And so it simulates a lot of different techniques in computer research on how erosion should be done. And then we get some really interesting results. We get valleys that have rivers in the center, and the rivers sort of cut their own way through. And so this kind of just shows that the river will take the least path of resistance where it can. We also get really nice sort of winding rivers. And finally, we also get splits in rivers, and where rivers will run into one another. And so this system adds not only the rivers and the water to the world to make them very realistic, but also how a lot of the mountains are generated, because the erosion from the mountains will run off and sort of come down to the bottom, and then the mountains will look a lot more realistic as well. Another subsection of Veloren is our launcher. So we have our launcher is called Airshipper. It allows us to ship to any platform very easily and keep people updated. They can easily download the most recent nightly. They can see what has been happening in Veloren, as well as the most recent changelog. Another really big thing that adds to how Veloren looks is the changes that have been recently made to the landscape. And so one of the biggest ones is the level of detail. And the idea behind this is when you have mountains very far off in the distance, you don't want to render every single cube. And in fact, you can't, just because there's so many of them. And so when you put them all together, you can build a mesh that describes what the terrain looks like. And then you can see mountains very far off in the distance that are very low cost on the computer. There have also been recent changes to how clouds are rendered, and lighting and shadows have been overhauled so that mountains off in the distance, throughout the day, you can see shadows hitting them differently. And from this, we get some new breathtaking views with fog on the ground, clouds in the sky, and very nice lighting on the mountains. This was one of the biggest changes that we made to Veloren, because historically voxel games similar to this have had a view distance that is capped at a certain length, but in Veloren, when you see a mountain off in the distance, it's not fake, it's not just a backdrop, you are able to go up to it and explore the mountain as it looks to you. Next, we're going to hear from Zester about the process behind world gen and world simulation.
I'm Josh. I'm a computer science graduate, and in my free time I thought I'd take up a little project which has since grown far larger than I ever thought it would. During Valoren's development, we were quite inspired by certain other games. Notable examples that we list are Minecraft, Legend of Zelda, and also Dwarf Fortress. The last of those is one that I'm particularly interested in. I've always really enjoyed Dwarf Fortress. I admit I've often found it hard to get into, but that's not for lack of enjoying the gameplay once I'm there. And one thing I wanted to emphasize in Veloren was the extent to which the world was alive. One particularly interesting thing about Dwarf Fortress is that the characters in the world are not just phony. They don't appear as and when the player gets near and so on. The world actually simulates the characters even when you're not around. And along with this, they'll each have a history. So that history may go back maybe 10, 20, 30 years, and then their parents' history will go back further and further. And all in all, you end up with a few hundred years of history that are simulated in this world. It's quite interesting because this sort of systemic approach to game development, because you have all of these interacting systems. You have the economy, you have battles and wars and monsters and alliances between different groups and so on, diplomacy, and all of these things work together to create a world that really feels authentic when you play the game. You know, a typical trope is to have a quote-unquote procedurally generated world where things just pop into view and there's no sort of cohesion between everything. If you see a mountain, the only reason for that mountain being there is that the noise function that generated it gave a particularly high output at that moment. And there's a certain amount of dissatisfaction that comes with that, right? Because you've not got a justification for that mountain being there. Whereas in Dwarf Fortress, the game simulates things like erosion and so on. And so you have a justification for that mountain being there, and it will cast a shadow on other pits of the ground and so on, and you'll get trees nearby in the shadow, and it'll have a rain shadow even and things like that. And then that might then influence the civilizations that appear around the area, right? Because you have one side of the mountain that has more trees, so it's going to be better economically for civilizations that need trees to survive. So you're more likely to get elves on that side, for example. And all of these links between different seemingly independent things within the game produce a result that feels believable and feels like when you're exploring something that's tangible and you're able to reason about the world.
Next, we're going to take a look at some of the future of Veloren. So first off, let's take a look at funding. Veloren started as a side project for many people, and the point of it was that it would be open source, anybody could play it for free. However, over time, we've found that there are costs that we have to accrue, and so one of the primary ones is the server costs for the game, as well as for our continuous integration and other services. We've been using our own home servers to handle most of it, but in the future, we do need to make sure these can be sustained. And so we found a couple different ways to do this. The first one that we've implemented is an open collective page. And so even though this is a side project for all of us and we aren't expecting anything out of it, there are a lot of people who want to contribute and help with the project. And some of them are able to donate their time, but a lot of other people are more incentivized to donate their money. And so this is because they know that they can help the project out if they donate a little bit, and so we've given them the avenue to do so. And currently, this is just being used for server costs and other costs that Veloren is using. We also have many of our developers, many of our core developers, they have their own Patreon page, and we make sure to link out to them wherever we can, because for the developers, if there is someone who sees that perhaps our lead artist is working on something that they really like, then it makes a lot of sense to support that person on their own. But it also makes sense, and we've seen this paradigm sort of happen in many other open source projects such as Godot. Many of the core team members are starting to be hired on by the revenue that the project is able to generate through their open collective. And so although the project always stays free, many people are willing to donate so that the engine can go further, and then they can hire core contributors. And so this is an approach that we've sort of looked at going towards in the future, especially if we are able to gather more interest in our open collective. However, we've also sort of considered the potential of releasing the game on Steam for a small price. Anybody can still play the game for free through our launcher. However, to get it on Steam, there might be a $5 or $10 charge. And then this would help a lot, not only with the server costs, but also making sure that we can offer a little bit back to the core developers who have spent so much time on the project. We distribute Veloren. Of course, you can download the executable directly to your operating system. However, we quite a few package managers. We make sure to keep them up to date. And so with Nix, we have someone who came in and wrote the package file that Nix needs, and so it's available in Nix. We also have it available on Flatpak and the AUR. And finally, Gamer OS has packaged Veloren, I believe it was in August, into their base operating system. Veloren also does a decent amount of outreach. As I mentioned, we have our blog posts that we put out every week, but we sometimes make YouTube videos with some development updates or showing off the new version of Veloren. A couple of months ago, I did an interview with Gaming on Linux in which I talked about a lot of the concepts behind the development of Veloren, and this was a lot of fun to do, and it was super cool to be able to then link to this and show many of my friends what I've been working on. In the future, we hope to keep doing this type of outreach because it's very important not only to show off what the project is doing, but also the accomplishments we've made within the Rust language, and be able to show off people's work that they've been putting into the project. And finally, we've also seen some presence on Reddit. We have, of course, our own subreddit where we show off a lot of our own content. However, many people have been posting to other subreddits about Veloren. And so we have 2 posts here that went pretty viral relative to our other posts that were by random members of the community. And it's very cool to see that many of the other subreddits and other gamers are becoming interested in this type of project because it started out as a very small open source project, but it has grown to something that we think a lot of people will enjoy when we release a more final version. And that is it for my talk. Thank you very much for everybody for listening. I think I have a few minutes for questions, so I'll take those now.
2, 1, go. Thanks a lot for your wonderful talk, Forrest. Now let's see the questions we have. Okay, the first one. What made you decide on the current org structure? And do you have any recommendations for new free software projects starting up?
Yeah, so I think this is a pretty great question because especially when it comes to game development in the open source sense, you kind of have to look at it from a different perspective than you would other projects. A lot of people have come to work on Veloren because they're quite interested in what they can contribute to it and certain systems that they find very cool. And so for them, their motivation is sort of building off the game as it continues to expand. Now, if we compare that to many other open source projects, people might be contributing to 5 or 10 open source projects, and so they don't have the same amount of connectedness to the project. Now, I think further, one of the big things that we've also done is we follow sort of an iterative process on how we go about organization. And so at the beginning, when I started, I'm pretty sure we didn't have a sense of teams. We had some core developers, but that was about it. We brought in the working groups a little bit later, I think probably late 2019. Maybe somewhere in between, I'm not entirely sure. But the idea is that we need to keep improving on how we do it because we don't have one person up top managing every single team and making sure that everything is okay. And so when someone comes in and talks about how they think that the product can use this extra group or they think that it can go in this direction, we definitely need to listen to them and work with them on these ideas.
Okay, the next one. Does Valorant support ray tracing?
Yeah, so this is definitely a pretty great question. It does not. However, we do currently raycast our clouds. And so there are some areas in which like ideas like this are used. However, when it comes to the graphical side, we're doing everything. Of course, with lighting, we're looking at new research papers and implementing it. And I think that's not my domain, but I know that the guy who implemented it is a legend, and he does all this crazy stuff that I would never comprehend. But I think in the future, since it is open source and since there's new crates coming up for Rust all the time, it is possible that it might be easy for us to sub in some support for ray tracing. But that being said, I can't speak to it too much myself.
Okay. How much does the server hosting cost for hosting the server for the players?
Yeah, so when we host the servers, currently we're hosting it in Hetzner in Germany, and I think per month it's something like €6. And so I think more importantly, the specs that are needed to host a certain amount of players is what we need to care about, because we kind of want to expand out further than just a simple co-op game. And so if we want to have, say, 50 players playing on one server, interacting with one another in the same region, then we need to be able to come up with benchmarks on what that will need. And so recently, in our 0.7 release, I think we had about a maximum of 50 concurrent players online at one time, and our server has 4 gigabytes of RAM. There were a lot of points in the release party in which we crashed because we ran out of RAM, and so that wasn't great. But we have done a lot of stress testing to try and learn more about this. Now, also for CPUs, I think we're currently using 2 virtual CPUs on our server. And so this is important because we need the main thread to be doing a lot of the tick work every frame, and then also an extra thread to be able to handle a lot of the asynchronous tasks. So players connecting and disconnecting from the server, handling the TCP on that side. Also making sure that when we're saving the game to the SQLite file, that's able to be managed. And then since, as I mentioned, we're using an ECS system, lots of the calculations are done concurrently in different threads. And so that being said, we want to do research and to do testing to see if, say, a pretty strong server of 16 cores, 32 threads with 128 gigs of RAM can support, say, 100 or 200 players. And we think that there is a possibility for that, but there's a couple places that we're currently hitting a wall a little bit. So one of the big ones is network bandwidth. We've been doing a lot to improve it and change the compression rate of, for example, the chunks that we're sending over the network, the player information that we're sending over the network. But there's still a lot of work to be done in optimizing what types of messages we're sending and how can we maybe more efficiently cache some stuff on the client. And so there's a lot of work that's going into the networking and multiplayer side. So XMAC, our networking lead, is doing a lot of work and sort of testing and research to find out what's the best way to handle multiplayer so that we don't have to worry about that bandwidth too much. Then, so that's like the multiplayer side. Now, if we think on the framework side and the sort of game engine side, there's a lot of optimizations that have to be done in how we're doing a lot of stuff like our world generation, our world simulation, and our compression of information in the entity component system. And so with world generation and world simulation, a lot of world generation happens before the server starts. So making sure that your server doesn't have to spend like 2 hours creating a new map or something like that. That's a big one because, as I mentioned with the erosion and the rivers, there's a lot of simulation that has to happen ahead of time. Now, when the game is running, there's the world simulation. And so we're currently working on some new systems that will allow for characters, or rather NPCs, around the map to be simulated in real time when they are out of the view of players. And so if the whole world is alive and stuff is happening and calculations are being made, we need to make sure that this isn't putting too much of a toll on the server that needs to run 30 ticks per second, and that the server's not getting bogged down. And then finally, the last thing is making sure that our entity component system and how we manage memory and how we represent all of our data in memory isn't too overburdening on a server. And so I think one of the big things is we want to make sure that, say someone wants to host their own Veloren server, that they don't necessarily need incredibly powerful hardware, especially if they just want to play co-op with a couple of friends. It would be great to simulate all of these grandiose things, and if we can, that would be amazing, but also making sure that we come back down to sort of the smallest player who wants to play with a few friends. And so with this, we need to make sure that they can easily get stuff up and running. They don't have to worry about having a really super strong computer that can run everything. And then this also further expands out to the client, making sure that if you're playing on a computer from like 2015 without the best hardware, that we do have the options in the graphics that you can go down, you can turn a lot of stuff down and still get the core experience without maybe all of the extra stuff that we have running on our much larger servers.
Okay, and finally, also, do you have different realms, or people can host their own world servers?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. We've explored, well, I think we've more discussed this idea a lot. Like, it would be really cool to be able to have a Veloren world that interacts with other Veloren worlds, in the sense that I could take my character from one world and move it to another. Or how the world is created right now is it's a discrete world. You're essentially playing on an island with an infinite ocean, and so that's needed because our world simulation process has to have bounds to it. But say you would go to like the edge of one of the islands, and then you start like sailing to somewhere, and maybe as you're sailing, it switches you from one realm to another realm, or one shard to another shard, and that idea is really cool from like a distributed standpoint. Each server could be managing its own small island of Veloren, which I mean, it's still very large. I'm not sure about the kilometer square, but it's quite large to explore the entire island. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done, but we haven't necessarily seen the direction that we want to go. We can also expand it in many different ways. And so for that player who wants to just play on their computer with 3 friends, it needs to be very easy that you just have one world, and when you have like your sword that you acquired on this server, you can't carry it to other ones, but that's okay because you can still play with your friends. Now, on larger servers, it'd be awesome to have a cluster of 10 servers that are all working together to make sure that they can handle as many players as possible, and very epic things can happen. And so getting those player experiences to really build as far as we can and not make the technology be a restriction. And so have 200 players on a server and make sure that get that to be our max, but then have 1,000 player servers where players are actually on different shards but kind of interacting together. So I think there's a lot of area here that would be really cool to explore. We don't exactly know the answer yet, but I think that we don't necessarily also want to knock anything off the table.
Great, Forrest. Thanks a lot for sharing your great talk.
Yeah, thank you very much.
See you. Bye.
Bye.